Hello, friends and neighbors. Welcome in the light, where laughter's the answer and hearts are shining bright. With calloused hands and wits, so raise your sharp. Let's praise a place where love ignites the spark.
Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome to Sunnyside. Well, it's I guess it's a little later in the day when I might post my usual episode on a Monday. I'm recording this on a Monday, actually. Sometimes I do that. Sometimes it's on Sunday. Sometimes I'm really, with it, and I record it even earlier. But obviously, last week was something else. It was it certainly didn't start off as a crazy week, but it became one, didn't it? And obviously, I'm referring to the murder of Charlie Kirk. That was shocking, heartbreaking, and just it was very sad and very very sad. Sad as a country. And I'm not going to spend, believe it or not, an entire episode talking about Charlie Kirk. I think his words will continue to echo in the hearts and minds of a generation. I know that my son Jack, who's a sophomore in college, is quite affected by what he saw. And maybe that generation is experiencing in our time frame, for some reason, something similar to, what the generation that it was his age in the late 60s experienced. The impact of Charlie Kirk and his critical thinking, his reasoned arguments, self-deprecation, willingness to talk to anybody, engage in debate, honest debate, based in biblical faith, and clearly he was a very faithful person. I have no doubt that he is in paradise, and I'm not too worried about Charlie. I feel terrible, like you should. I think I would assume, if you have any sense of morality or humanity, that you'd feel terrible for his wife, who's now a widow, and his two children who get to grow up without their dad. That's just terrible. It's what happens, I suppose, when you cannot win an argument and you just turn to violence. And on that note, I think everybody else has said everything that needs to be said. I didn't know him. I think in the past, even in the sunny side of life, I'd hadn't always agreed with everything that Charlie had said, or maybe the way he said it, and I regret anything that I might have said that lent a disparaging tone. It's easy to be critical of somebody when they're still alive and they haven't been murdered in front of the entire world. And so forgive me for that. I appreciate what his message was, and he's right. Preaching family values, get married, be useful, have children. Most importantly, follow God through Christ, and live the life that God intended for you to have. We probably don't know what that is a lot of the times, and so that's a good thing. I think if you're a person who would celebrate that type of violence and that type of cowardice, you need to question your humanity. There's something very wrong with you. You need to pray for your soul, because at the end of the day, you need to, really need to find repentance, because you're gonna end up repenting one way or the other, and we should all take a moment to do that. So I would caution everybody that's, if they're celebrating something as horrific as that, that'd be like celebrating, and there probably were people celebrating Martin Luther King Jr., and his assassination. It's a generational. It's going to make an impact. It's not going to stop. And it happened the day before 9/11. And if you remember, as I do, what happened at 9/11 was on 9/12, people were fired up. The nation was united, and we had a common enemy. So I think that that's probably likely to happen again. But what I've seen so far is I haven't seen violence from the supporters of Charlie Kirk. I've seen it from the other side, and I think that's despicable. Anyway, that's how that started out on 9/11. Sorry, on the 10th. That was Wednesday. Then that happened. So that was very shocking. And then, of course, they did finally catch the guy, or the alleged killer. They're pretty sure that they've got the right guy. A lot of politicians involved with it. Lots of things going on. Pretty high profile character. I don't have. I just like anybody else. I'm like, I would hope that we put as much effort into finding everybody's murderer as we did in this particular case, but also because of the scale, scope, and just the worldwide attention on it, and people want answers and they want them immediately. And so it's just it's a little bit of a disparity between our priorities sometimes, but I'm glad that they got who they think that they've got. And now I'm hearing a lot of people advocating for the death penalty, and I understand that because the vengeful spirit is certainly present, and I understand the scales of justice and the argument that it's impossible to reform a person capable of ever repaying the loss and damages via that type of murder. And so sometimes people argue that it's the entire lifetime is not enough time to repay the damages, and so they like the eye for an eye thing. And I don't know what Charlie Kirk's stance was on capital punishment. I know what mine is, which is probably different than what a lot of conservatives believe. But just try to put Christ first, and I'm thinking Jesus probably isn't in favor of the eye for an eye thing. His judgment, at the end of time is going to take care of everything anyway. And we have to believe in repentance. We should be praying for this young man, and that if he's guilty and he's found, he's charged, that if he's not given the death penalty, it's life in prison is still the death penalty. By the way, they still die in prison. But we, as a faithful person, I believe that we have to provide the opportunity, just like with Saul of Tarsus on the road to, became Paul. If you believe in that story, which I do, that you can be redeemed, and that you can spend then the rest of your life, whatever it is, serving the Lord, then I have to believe that that's the right answer when it comes to our reform system. However this plays out, there's a lot of people that we have to pray for as faithful people, and that includes the murderer and his family. And that might be difficult to do, but this is in God's hands. And I think that, if anything, Charlie Kirk was excellent at arguing that point. All right, so 9/11 was the next day, and of course we all know what happened 9/11/2001. I've already mentioned it, and so we continue to remember it 24 years later now. It seems like it doesn't seem like that long ago to me, but time does fly, and it keeps on ticking. And there's just so many people that the young generation, probably a lot that follow Charlie Kirk, have never they're aware of 9/11 in the same way that I was aware of Pearl Harbor, but I did not live in it. And so it's something that we continue to recognize, and I wonder, at what point will it become like Pearl Harbor, the 9/11 attacks. 9/11, by the way, is also my wife's birthday, so it's it's always like that. How would you like that to be your birthday? It's just like thanks, Osama. You wrecked, everybody thinks of 9/11 for good cause, of the attacks on the United States and the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and the down flight in Pennsylvania. It's my wife's birthday, so we want to celebrate that. And we did. We went out to eat, and it was a small, family type thing that we celebrate. And then 9/12 happened, and this is what I'm really going to talk about today, because Charlie Kirk influenced a lot of people, way, way, way more people, but he didn't have the influence and impact on me. I feel like I can argue my points honestly and from a statement of faith as well. So I didn't listen to his podcast. I followed him, on the fringe. I appreciated his ability to organize and to relate to young people, and I thought that was all very good, and I hope that continues to grow. But I didn't, follow him regularly. So his impact on me personally was just one of admiration, and I appreciated, what he was doing, and that was about it. So I'll leave it to the people that know him best. But on 9/12, I did lose a person that, we all did in our family, that made a huge impact on my life and all of our lives. And that was my father-in-law, Dennis Burkholder. For the last, 3-4 years, you could see the signs of Alzheimer's taking their effect. And we knew that was coming for probably a decade. We knew that because he's the youngest. My father-in-law, Dennis, was the youngest of his siblings by a lot. I think his next oldest sibling was probably 10 years older than him. So he was, always the kid brother in a good-sized family, and almost like an only child to some degree. His sisters were obviously there to help raise him at first, but then obviously they went on to do other things, and he was in there growing up with his aging parents in North Dakota, in Rock Lake, North Dakota. He was an athlete. He was a joker. He was very creative, great storyteller, and very kind. Like he could say things that could be critical, but he would say them either in a witty or funny way, I guess, that would make people giggle or laugh a little bit, or maybe just burst out laughing. Or he would say something very serious, but he had to have a twinkle in his eye, which expressed that he meant it. But you didn't have to say things in a way that would, break people's heart. I've known him, I suppose, for, in one way or another, 25 years, maybe 30 years to some degree. Heidi and I have been married almost 21 years. And so part of that family, the Burkholders, for the last 22 years. And I would say I never really saw him get very upset about anything. I mean, I saw him get upset about the Minnesota Vikings and get frustrated with the Twins, and I saw him get frustrated with basically any professional Minnesota sports teams. I saw him get frustrated on the golf course. I never saw him throw a club or get upset or anything. He would never do that. He loved the game of golf, and he particularly appreciated the rules associated with the game of golf. And I'm sure that I always disappointed him in my inability to be successful as a golfer, but he did pretty well teaching his children. My brother-in-law and my sister-in-law are second now in the state of Iowa. They'd been champions for couples tournaments for, I think, 4 times state champions, and this time they came in as runner-up this past weekend. There's a lot of good golfers, and the kids are all good golfers, and my wife's a good golfer, and so they're okay. So I'm the oddball out on that. But I really do, as you know, if you listen to this show, I like telling stories. I appreciate a good story with a good twist and a hook, maybe a little sentimental, maybe a little, hopefully humorous most of the time. Make you think, maybe have a point. Right? Just like in planes, trains, and automobiles. Here's an idea. When you're telling a story, have a point. It really helps the listener. And he always had a point. It might have been a mischievous point, or it might have been a little quirky point, or it might have been funny, but he got to it. He was a very influential person in our local community. Not in the sense that he would wield political power at all, or that he was, necessarily on committees or in organizations. It's just that everybody knew him and they liked him. And for years, that's how I first got to know him. He had written articles for the local newspapers, and they got, just on a small circuit of newspapers around. He wrote a weekly article, a weekly column called Shooting the Breeze. And I've shared some of those stories with you on this show, and they're funny. They're good stories. Some of them obviously are dated now because he was commenting on things that were happening in the 90s. And obviously not all of that translates to the 21st century as well as we might hope. But that's how I first got to really know him, is that I would read these articles of this guy who had this Dave Barry, Louis Grizzard-like wit that I could appreciate, and just wrote for the local paper. And I liked to write that too, and that way too. And so when I was in college, inspired by him, I would write my own column for the college paper, the Waldorf Lobbyist. And those articles were called Shot Out of the Dark. And I would do the same thing and try to make tongue-in-cheek commentary on things that were happening, inspired by, largely by my future father-in-law, Denny Burkholder. Well, for the last few years, like I said, 10 years ago, he pretty much predicted, after his older siblings had experienced the same type of fate regarding Alzheimer's and dementia, he was very well aware of the symptoms and what that looks like at the end. And I think it haunted him, but he predicted it. He said, how it's going to go for me too. And he tried to forewarn us that all of these things, and we accepted it. We understood it, but we still kind of ignored it because you don't want to think about it. He had shown, a decade, there was no sign of it. But in the last few years, more than just the usual senior moments, he began to forget things. Or become confused, or tell the same story over and over again, or ask, where he was, or make the same commentary over and over again. And there are many examples of it, but I don't need to get into it. It's just the par for the course. And I know that there are so many people that have had or are having that experience, right now with someone that they love, whether it's their mother or father, or mother and father-in-law, or a grandparent, or whatever it happens to be. And it is frustrating and scary and sad, because such a great storyteller as Denny was, whether he wrote it down or he would just tell it to you, he would be able to tell the same story almost verbatim in the same way, even as his memory was in decline, which just shows you that if you learn something well, that it sticks with you, and that you can continue to recite those words, even in the same way with the same pauses, and all of that stuff. So we're very familiar with some of his best stories as a family, but he has so many. It's quite a lifetime. And so when those moments came where he would say things like walking out of a Waldorf University football game. This was a couple of years ago, and they were, big win, and he would say he's just walking out of the game that he just watched, and then his son would say, "Hey, Dad, how about that? That's a big win." And he's like, "It's not what I saw." And he's like, "Are you kidding me? They just won." And he's like, "It's not what I read." And you forget the the game that you just saw. He loved watching sports. He loved it, and he loved making commentary, particularly on the officials. I don't think Dennis ever got the memo in the 21st century that you were supposed to be kinder to the officials of games, because I think that was a part of the game to him. He grew up in a time when you let your you let the umpire know what you thought of his call. You let the referee know. And now the officials are so sensitive. You think that they're going to, melt if it rains or something like that. But he comes from a time and a generation and a state championship baseball team up in North Dakota where, you played hard and words didn't break your heart, which is interesting in a time that we live in today, considering the last week. So he loved to harass the officials, much to our embarrassment sometimes. But he didn't do it and even that, he didn't do it in a rude or vulgar way. He never did that. It was always a funny and witty way that would make people giggle around him. And I think even sometimes the officials might have appreciated some of his more witty commentary. He was beyond being a great storyteller. He was an inventor. He invented a game called Pendoodlum, and you can look it up on YouTube. There's some old commercials out there that might feature my wife and my brother-in-law when they were kids. It was based on a school project that my wife was doing, and he helped build this thing that his dad had taught him, using counterweights and whatnot. You could put markers on a pendulum, and if you did it right, it would make all these unique and different circular designs, and you could change colors, and it really was something. I mean, it was something before cell phones. For sure. I mean, I don't know if it would ever catch on anymore because it's so basic, but maybe some of the older games are coming back. I don't know. It was something that he really invested a lot into and went around the country to shows and exhibits and fairs and whatnot, and trying to sell these this Pendoodlum game. And it never took off. It was always so close just to the next big distributor. Like if Walmart had picked it up or something like that, maybe it would have been different. But it wasn't. It didn't work out, and I think that was very disappointing. And I think it was financially trying as well, because really I'd invested a lot into this. We still have a Pendoodlum game, and it is fun to set up. It's a little bit more involved. Toys back then, you had to work a little bit, and so you have to get it set up, and that's kind of the process as well. And then you get your papers, and you can get your markers. And he always said later that in the last decade, he would say that Pendoodlum today with the internet like that would really do well. And he also said the markers are so much better today than the crap we had back then. And so, he never gave up on the Pendoodlum idea, but it didn't go anywhere. And so they moved from North Dakota, where he and his wife, my mother-in-law, Bev, had been teachers, educators. They moved from there somewhere in that process to Minnesota, to Blue Earth, Minnesota. That's where my wife, she graduated from. And then they moved to Forest City after that. And so he's been part of our hometown for a long time, 30 some years. And again, made an impact where he was at. Friends on the golf course, friends in the community, friends with Winnebago Industries. He ended up heading up their Winnebago Itasca Travelers group nationally, and got to travel all over the country. And he and my mother-in-law were like the homecoming king and queen, or the prom king and queen, of all of these Winnebago and Itasca Travelers group rallies and states and territories and provinces and whatnot. So it was a great 8 years. I think they did it for 8 years, and they got a company car, which was an RV they could live in, as they traveled around and just met with people that owned Winnebagos and gathered together in amazing places all over the country. And he was perfect at that. He was great at meeting people and conversing with people and sharing stories, and keeping that camping spirit alive, that to some degree has disappeared just around the country. It used to be that there would be people would be more outdoors. Now we're outdoors, but we're like, I'm living the van life. Like, and I mean, it's not quite the same thing, So, so he did that. He and Bev did that for a long time, and then they retired, and then they came and lived here at Sunnyside after a while, and they've been here ever since. In the last year, it's gotten a lot worse since Easter. It was very difficult. He had an episode that put him in the hospital with pneumonia, and then they discovered that he had some heart things going on, and he was kind of immobile, and it just seems like it took a steep turn after that medical moment, and he was in the hospital through Easter, for about 10 days or so. They came home, and he had gotten very, he slept a lot. He was confused. He would get up and want to go places. He was convinced that they were not living in their house, that they needed to move somewhere. All of these things that happen when this type of thing occurs. And I didn't make it any better, by the way. I built the garage for them on the house that they have, and then the garage that they had been parking in, which was really a shed for the last 10 years that he was used to driving into. Well, I built them a garage that's connected to their house, and so then I put my hay in where he had parked for 10 years, and he was already losing his memory, and so he'd opened up the garage door, and it's full of hay, which is kind of confusing, I suppose, and frustrating, and so he didn't like that. But I would say, well, your garage is over there, and all of that. But he just lost his memory, and I got to imagine that that's very frightening for anybody. And I think he also knew the whole time. On Friday night, he passed away in the afternoon, about 4:45, right just before 5:00 on Friday, the 12th, and Heidi and my brother-in-law and my sister-in-law and my mother-in-law, they were all up there with him. My mother-in-law had gotten the call about 4:00 in the morning, and she called my wife, and they were up in Northwood together, and spent the last day with them, believing that was his last day, and it was. And he passed away before 5:00 on the 12th, in the presence of his loving family and very helpful nurses and staff and all of that. But and it's a relief. It's very sad. We miss him very much, but it is also a relief that he was, in many ways, he had left us a few months ago, forgetting who we were, starting with the least important guys like me, who he just might refer to as the big guy, or whatever, and then but then eventually kids and grandkids and friends and even his own wife, and that's not his fault. It just is what happens, and I think it's frustrating. It had to be frustrating for him. I told his friend, because I announced the football game on Friday night, very, very good friend, golfing buddy, and he asked, he hadn't heard and he hadn't seen Denny in a while, and he said, how's Denny doing, as he came in to help with the press box stuff that we do up there, like running the scoreboard and the clock and all that. And I had to tell him that he passed away, and he was very heartbroken by that. But then he had said too that we talked a little bit later, and he said, I said, I think he knew it was coming, and I think he hated it, and Tom has just said, yeah, he did. He told me over and over again he hated this, losing his memory. So if you're in that situation, I get it. We've been living with this for a few years, and we were forewarned of it for quite a while, and we just you kind of watch it happen, and you try to do the best that you can and provide all of the things that you can and the care that you need, and and it's a challenge. And to be honest with you, there's not a ton of help or preparation. There's agencies and organizations that take care of the elderly, but memory care is a whole different animal, and it's a challenge. And there's just a lot of things that I wish we had to learn on the fly. Unfortunately, that's when people learn it. So we had some helpful people that helped us out with that a lot, and thanks to them. But so my father-in-law passed away on the 12th. It was my wife's birthday on the 11th, which is also Patriot Day because of September 11th. And Charlie Kirk was shot on Wednesday and killed. So quite a week. But I want to spend just a little bit of time telling you the rest of the things about my father-in-law, which I feel are important because a lot of people, my wife said, hey, you need to do some of this stuff. Well, one of the things that he told a lot of stories, and a lot of his stories are recorded because, well, either this studio or more importantly, the, decade of articles that he wrote and with his wit and humor. And so that stuff is perfect. And it's a great way to really get a sense for who he is. So we're blessed in that regard that we have his memory and we can still hear his voice through those things. And isn't modern technology great that we have the ability to have so many photos, digital photos, and so many recordings? We just, start recording on our phone and we've got, video of these people. We don't have to carry this clunky recorder around. But some of his stories, I guess, came from his time that he spent very formatively in the Peace Corps. And I found this very interesting because I was never in the Peace Corps. I was in the Army, 26 years. And so kind of a little bit different there, but I was interested in that and what he did. And so there's a book that was written and published by Gary Dean Peterson, and it's Tales from Columbia is what it's called, The Deeds and Misdeeds of 41 Peace Corps volunteers who answered President Kennedy's call to serve. It's the class of essentially Columbia. It's the class of 1964. They called themselves the class of 64. They were in Columbia in 1964 for that year. That was their assignment in the Peace Corps, and this is that group. And so they put together their stories, and some of these we never heard before. So I thought it was interesting, and he truly did answer President Kennedy's call. Which, by the way, if you're not sure what that sounds like, it sounds like this.
Of all Americans, men and women, young and old, to serve in the Peace Corps, to serve in all parts of the world, to serve at little pay, to do jobs that most of them have never done before, is one of the most encouraging manifestations of the American spirit that this country has seen in many years. The Peace Corps gives us a chance to show a side of our country which is too often submerged. Our desire to live in peace, our desire to be of help. I hope in the coming months and years that many of you will follow the example of those who've gone before. They, I think, are serving this country well. And in a very real sense, they are serving a larger cause, the cause of freedom and the cause of a peaceful world. They are demonstrating their interest in people who may live on the other side of the globe, who may live in poverty and misery, but who, because of the presence of the Peace Corps, live in hope. I hope this spirit will grow, and that hundreds of others of young Americans and older Americans will go overseas to show our best side, to show how much we desire to live at peace. There can be no greater service to our country, and no source of pride more real than to be a member of the Peace Corps of the United States.
Yeah, so there you go. That's President Kennedy, obviously, from 1961, I believe, is when that speech was put out. And he had, it was one of his ideas. And I think Sergeant Shriver, who was a relative of his, maybe an uncle or something like that, kind of ran the Peace Corps, ran it all. And so that all started there. An interesting call to the youth of the nation and an opportunity. I mean, we had advisors in Vietnam, but Vietnam wasn't really a thing quite yet at that time. And so it seemed like a new era, a new beginning, an opportunity for young people to help make the world a better place by to fight communism, honestly, to keep it, because we could be the nice guys and we could show them how to do useful things and to have self-reliance and grow and sell and develop their businesses and maintain a free mind and free markets. That was the idea, and the Peace Corps still exists. So it's interesting to me that that's how that all started, and maybe there's some words in there from President Kennedy, we just heard, that we could apply today in as well, which I think, considering things that are going on, those are probably good words to remember. So I think I'll start by talking about, I'm going to go through his Peace Corps career, because this is probably not something that you're going to read about. It's not something that he necessarily had in his articles, some of his stories that he shared with friends and family. But ultimately, you'll get the idea of how this worked out. And so I'll just read it to you. Perhaps the most surprised trainee among those going to Puerto Rico was Dennis Burkholder of Rock Lake, North Dakota. He was undoubtedly the first of the group to send in his application to join what was then a fledgling experiment. In the spring of 1962, a 19-year-old Dennis sat in his freshman honors English classroom at the North Dakota School of Forestry at Bottineau Junior College, located just 20 miles from the Canadian border. The day's assignment was a research paper due in 1 week. 6 days later, he began his extensive research on his chosen topic, the Peace Corps. Frankly, there wasn't much data to research in those early days, and the resulting paper was a little too short and needed some padding. His old maid instructor was inclined to be emotional and sensitive, so Dennis decided that penning a poem would be just the thing to save him from the dreaded D. I love my country, my home, and this land. No other country so great and so grand. Freedom for everyone, 'tis not just a dream. In the U.S. of A., the country supreme. The drivel served its purpose and earned the author a B-. Good enough. Unpredictably, it also planted a seed of interest in Burkholder, and he sent in an application to join the Peace Corps. Not surprisingly, it went unanswered. 2 years and 3 college transfers later, an invitation to join a group training for agriculture and nutrition to serve in Colombia, South America, arrived in the mail. Dennis had given up on ever hearing anything on his application, but now here it was, an acceptance. Well, why not? Dennis arrived in Lincoln, Nebraska, studied Spanish, drown-proofed, ran around the tractor testing track, played foursquare, self-defended a la Deadly Dudley's CIA-inspired kill with one well-placed ashtray delivered to the nose in a hard upward thrust, and kept up with the ASWAC well enough to evade the preliminary rounds of the dreaded D-selection process. The death squad of psychologists and psychiatrists hadn't noticed any of his mental deficiencies. With just Puerto Rico training and one more D-selection remaining, he had survived Nebraska. So in Puerto Rico is where they went next, this group of trainees to participate in the Peace Corps as they were going to go to Colombia. And it goes on. So they're in Puerto Rico. Our Puerto Rican experience came to an end on December 22nd, and the next day, this is 1963, the next day we boarded the plane in San Juan for the trip back to the States and Christmas with family and friends. As we settled into our seats for the takeoff, Most of us just wanted some sleep, but one trainee, now a full-fledged volunteer, could only marvel at the series of events that had brought him this far. Burkholder had gone through Nebraska training in awe of his fellow volunteers, some of whom came from prestigious universities from all around the country. Still amazed and dazed, he entered the Puerto Rican chapter of his adventure, too dumb to be scared of outward-bound training, rappelling on the face of a dam, cliff climbing, drown-proofing in the Caribbean Sea, a 4-day survival hike from hell through the rainforest, intra-camp runs in pre-dawn light, spending 2 weeks in Ponce all alone. He celebrated his 21st birthday and final selection in camp and didn't even notice the small earthquake that shook the shelter. Unbelievably, he had been selected, or more correctly, not deselected. And now it was off to Colombia. As he would say, ufta, which is North Dakotan, or que estoy haciendo, which is Spanish. A lot of these, like I said, these are stories that are shared with his group that then were put together in this book, The Tales from Colombia by Gary Dean Peterson. And it's just a very, very interesting time, I guess, in the life of the early 60s when this group was being sent out to Colombia, which was, obviously it was a country and they were been around for a long time, but some things were happening in South America. Some things were happening in Latin America in general. We were deep within the Cold War. There was a competition to get to space. There was all of these things happening. And the influence of communists and socialists and Marxists in general was strong. And so Kennedy, people forget, was not in favor of that. So the party of Kennedy has come quite fallen far from the Kennedy tree in that regard. But what can you say? This is what happened. So they put my father-in-law, the Peace Corps assigned him to a place in very remote part of kind of in the middle. And then maybe the eastern spot of Colombia, which of course is a country on the northern end of South America, and very small. The nearest town would be kind of close to, I guess Medellin would be. I might have that wrong. Bogota, I guess, would be the biggest city nearby, but that was a half a day travel. So, and so Dennis Burkholder was assigned essentially to Villavicencio Meta out on the Llanos. About the only areas of Colombia that weren't covered by this group were the Pacific coast, the far eastern Llanos territories, and the jungles of the Amazon River Basin, even though those areas would be visited by members of the Columbia 64 group traveling on business and vacation sometime. So they'd get a chance to see parts of it. But it was, I guess the town of Villavicencio would be fairly large, but that was not actually where he was placed. He was at a much smaller village a ways away from that even. So there you go. That's I forget off the top of my head what that was called, and it'll come back to me. But he lived in this little village, as for at least half of the time, and you'll find out why he was only there for half of his year in just a second. This was a young group of people, in their early 20s. They were volunteers, and they came from all over the place, and one of the characters that went along with it was a guy named Brian McMahon that Denny spent some time with, and he was a true cowboy from I think Montana was where it was when Brian came from, and so one of these experiences. This is a story that people haven't necessarily heard in the family, so it was fun to find it. But then he says, Brian was part of a whole bunch of crazy memories for me. One was the Christmas bullfight in some little town up north where they had several medium-sized steers for the local macho toreador wannabes to fight. And by the way, reading this book, I get the impression that none of the Peace Corps people felt particularly impressed by the machismo of the South American men. Whatever. It was kind of pathetic. And so Brian, this is Brian McMahon that Denny's talking about, braced with ample hops, gimps into the arena. He stares down a steer, and he grabs it a la cowboy mode and just throws it to the ground. The crowd did not appreciate the fine rodeo-style steer wrestling demonstration, and they booed this Brian McMahon because he spoiled their fun. Talk about machismo. And Denny laughed till beer spewed out of his nose. Brian really was a cowboy, and he knew how to handle animals. He was the only guy, according to Denny, who ever made my horse behave. Yes, Denny had a horse in South America, in Colombia, and he named it Horse. Which doesn't necessarily give you much. It's like, well, that doesn't sound very original. Or maybe it's just funny when you name an animal in another language to the people, the native locals. But anyway, he goes on, and he lives in, this small town, and he's getting to know the locals, and there's a few things that are happening in it. So again, he's about a half a day away from Bogota. He's maybe an hour by bus away or whatever from the larger community, and he's in this much smaller town. And I just want to tell you what his life was like there. So this is part of the Villavicencio area that that Denny was assigned to, and he's out in these harsh conditions and even more intransigent population. I think it's called Guacavilla, which is a village in the department of Meta, on which Villavicencio was the capital. So Guacavilla was where he was at, and it was as forlorn as any site in Colombia. Denny Burkholder, from the northern plains of the United States, North Dakota to be exact, found himself right smack in the middle of this area in this little town. The remote outpost on the western edge of Colombia's vast eastern plains, Guacavilla, could barely be called a village, with two dusty streets intersecting in a T in the center of town. A cluster of houses constructed of miscellaneous boards, cane, and bamboo, coated with a plaster composed of a mixture of mud and manure, lined the two streets in this village. With these whitewashed structures had thatched roofs and dirt floors. A few rundown tiendas supplied the town's essentials, with one store doubling as the once weekly meat market. The population of the village was a couple of hundred, not counting the students at the boarding school where the Peace Corps volunteer, Denny, was scheduled to teach English, agriculture, and nutrition. There were two other significant structures in this tiny village, and both were of vital importance to the inhabitants. An impressive cathedral stood out from the surrounding squalor and served the 99.5% Catholic population. Dennis comprised the other 0.5%, but he pretended to be Catholic because it was either that or he'd be considered a communist. More importantly, there was a policia headquarters manned by the military officers who were inordinately proud of the fact that they had carbines and live ammo. Some of these soldiers appeared to be too young to be soldiers, which was a bit disconcerting to Dennis. Richard Falksa of Buffalo, Wyoming, was a veteran volunteer finishing up his term with the Peace Corps, who accepted Dennis into his house and the site located about 3/4 a mile from town. Guacavilla had been one of the original sites to host volunteers and was fortunate to have been staffed by some of the early legends of Peace Corps Colombia. Don Ricardo was truly, that's what they called Richard Fox. Don Ricardo was truly a super volunteer with a shopping list of accomplished community action projects. He tolerated this new volunteer and shuddered at his poor command of the language privately. Truth be told, he did not think this new addition to his sight measured up, but Richard was too much the gentleman to ever say that out loud. A few months later, Richard ended his service, leaving Dennis alone in this desolate village. Really alone. There was no volunteer within 100 miles of Guacavia. There was no one who spoke English to be found. Rodney Spokley was to have been Dennis's partner, but he had been delayed in coming to the country for medical reasons, and when he did arrive, he was sent to a different site. Dennis settled in as best he could with no one to talk to but Spanish speakers. His language skills improved rapidly, and he developed a routine work schedule. He did have occasional visitors, though sometimes these were not welcome or even human. One time, a boa constrictor slithered its way into his kitchen, where Dennis says, "I was eating lunch. In total fear and outright panic, I grabbed my machete and winged it at him with such force that the tip of the blade stuck in the cement floor, causing the machete to break. The clatter must have annoyed the boa constrictor, for it made its exit to the yard where it lingered. Finally, some neighbor kids came over and hauled the monster down to the river, depositing it in the water." Other than these interludes of rare excitement, Dennis worked on the program he had been trained to carry out. As with other members of Columbia 64, these began with simple projects in agriculture and nutrition. Alone, El Gringo, as he was known in the village, began working on garden projects, rabbit projects, latrine construction projects, and he also taught classes at the school. The rabbits hated Dennis and scratched him and bit him. Damn them anyway. Dennis hated the rabbits right back. It was not a happy relationship. The gardens were another matter. The soil was extremely fertile, and any plant that bore its fruit above the ground thrived. The volunteer grew a tomato that weighed 3 pounds, nurtured a pole bean plant that went up, then down, then up, and halfway down again on a 10-foot pole. The instructions for planting green beans were simple. Put the seed in the ground and get the hell out of the way. Villagers took notice and asked for help in planting and maintaining their own gardens. These garden projects produced an abundance of vegetables, and several villagers eventually turned their enterprises into a profitable cash crop. The children in the area were not healthy, a perennial problem in Columbia, it seemed. 1 in 5 died before the age of 5. There were very few bathroom facilities or toilets. The preferred place for villagers to relieve themselves was in the fields or gardens or rivers. Education was crucial to the understanding that latrine usage was necessary, and it was an uphill battle. Purina Corporation provided a high-protein mixture known as encaparina to one of the organizations Dennis worked with that was free of charge to families who would then mix this supplement into the diet of their young children. It was similar to oatmeal in consistency and had to be disguised pretty well to be palatable. Even though it was free, it was not used by the families. And caparina was to become one of the 3 elements that turned around the public opinion of El Gringo. Dennis won a raffle at the school, with the prize being a freshly weaned pig from a neighbor's litter. Pig, as he was named, took up residence in the pasture corral in back of Dennis's house. Pig, not to be confused with Dennis's dog, named Dog, or horse, named Horse, subsisted on a diet of field corn and scraps. One day, Dennis mixed some encaparina into Pig's feed. Pig loved it. Pig thrived and grew quickly. The villagers knew that Pig had brothers and sisters just down the trail. Within 2 months, Pig was twice the size of his siblings. The villagers were impressed. They had to admit it. El Gringo could sure grow vegetables and pigs. Dennis was becoming known for his expertise in agriculture, but gaining real acceptance, well, that that was another matter. Ultimately, it was a completely different event that gained their respect. Don Jaime had been a thorn in Dennis's side ever since his arrival. Jaime was reputedly backed by someone of influence, perhaps linked to the Violencia, but nonetheless, one not to be messed with. Don Jaime liked to make fun of El Gringo by saying things about him in Castellano that he didn't think Dennis understood. One night, after several bouts of aguardiente, I don't know how to say this, aguardiente, and several cervezas, I know what that is, Don Jaime challenged El Gringo to a game of billiards. Now, Dennis was not a novice at this game and was on the verge of winning when Jaime called him a dirty word. Well, fortunately, the village youth had been happy to teach Dennis all the dirty Spanish words, so he understood clearly what Jaime had called him. Buoyed with liquid courage, he suddenly grabbed Don Jaime with both hands. Holding his shirt, Dennis lifted the troublemaker up and slammed him onto the billiard table. El Gringo then grasped each side of Jaime's reddening face and called him every dirty name he could think of. Pretty much every dirty word in the Spanish language, culminated with the granddaddy of them all, hijo de puta. Dennis accompanied this parting shot by slamming Jaime's head on the table one more time. There was dead silence in the room. Dennis wished the onlookers a buenas noches, que duerme con la Virgen, and walked home, convinced that he had just written his airplane ticket back to North Dakota. Well, the next day, El Gringo walked to the school with a foreboding knowledge that he was in deep trouble. Would the townspeople just stay away from him now and give him the silent treatment, or would they be openly hostile to him? Surely someone would get in touch with Peace Corps headquarters in Bogota soon if they had not already done so, and he would be gone. Dennis approached the first person he had seen since the previous night and waited to see if he would even be acknowledged. Nodding slightly, the villager said, "Buenos dias, Don Daniel." Daniel was the town's translation of Dennis. Dennis the Menace of the comics was translated into Daniel el Tavioso. Surprised, Dennis walked on toward the school. Villager after villager approached him with all the same greeting. Buenos dias, Don Daniel. The name El Gringo was forgotten. Don Daniel had dared to challenge Don Jaime. Word of the events of the previous evening had spread quickly through the pueblo. Before the night was even out, Don Daniel was known in town as someone of consequence. It was a new day dawning. If this seems to sound like something out of a Western movie, it should not be surprising. The Llanos was the Wild West of Colombia. Well, okay, technically the Wild East. The men fancied themselves great horsemen, fighters, and lovers. Machismo was their defining character value. The men boasted about their possessions in order of importance: my horse, my gun, and my wife. The men did not work very hard. They drank, they raced their horses, and spent the rest of their time working on their reputation as a great lover and romantic. The women worked, took care of the children, prepared the meals, washed the clothes, and took care of the house. The women of Colombia could be exquisitely beautiful until age 18 or marriage, whichever came first, at which time the ravages of their workload and perpetual pregnancies took their toll. Because he was in a remote site and alone, Peace Corps designated the Guacavia as a hardship site, which allowed Dennis unlimited rest days away from the site without having to use vacation days. It also provided him with 250 extra pesos a month, bringing his total paycheck to 1,600 pesos a month. That's about $75 maybe, more or less. His lifestyle was Spartan. The rent on his shack cost 60 pesos a month. Laundry ran about the same, and the meals brought 3 times daily to his home by the neighbors cost 300 pesos. The menu was unchanging. Breakfast was a fried egg on rice with water-based hot chocolate to drink. Lunch was fried platano with rice and beans. And the evening meal was a vegetable soup, yuca, an occasional slice of meat, and a hunk of bread. The monthly budget left Dennis with about 1,200 pesos a month to spend on whatever. Whatever, however, was limited. A game of billiards cost a peso. A warm beer cost a peso. A warm pop cost about 40 centavos. A bowl of chicken noodle soup and a hunk of beef cooked on a vertical wood stake next to a blazing fire was available on market day once a week for 4 pesos. There was nothing else on which to spend his money. That's where unlimited rest days came in. Bogota was a hair-raising half-day bus ride through the mountains. In Bogota, Dennis could find Peace Corps friends and spend his money. Peace Corps money was communal. If you had money, you spent it. If another volunteer was out of money, you gave him some of yours. It was similar to playing a 2-year-long game of Monopoly and not caring who won. Every 2 weeks, Dennis would take a 1-hour trip on a small, open-sided bus, known as a chiva, to Villa Vicencio, where he could pick up his mail and eat some good Chinese food and have cold beer. There would be a few letters from a faithful girlfriend and several from his parents for 20 months. There was no communication with his parents other than through these letters. That seems stranger now in these days than it did then. On one of those trips to Villa Vo, as they called it, Dennis was in a bar where he met the crew of a U.S. Air Force C-47 that was transporting a load of gasoline, 55-gallon drums, to a group of Wycliffe Bible translators who were living out on the Amazon. After a dozen rounds of cervezas, it became the consensus of this group that, hey, you might as well fly with us if you want to see the Amazon. Just be at the hotel at 6 a.m. Promptly at 6 a.m., a slightly hungover Dennis met the part of the crew that managed to show up for breakfast at the hotel. The 6-man crew was down to 3. The group traveled by cab to the Colombian Air Force facility, where the C-47 was parked off to the side of the graveled runway. After a careful pre-flight check of the engines, which basically was just the pilot who did a pull-up of the motor mounts on the 2 engines and gave a precursory glance and pronounced them good to go, the plane took off and quickly rose above the clouds, which made getting a view of the Llanos impossible. The 3rd crew member just lay down on the barrels of gasoline and fell into a drunken slumber. A queasy Dennis sat in the uncomfortable drop-down web seat and jolted along for several hours of humpy travel. Eventually, the co-pilot left the cabin and came back to have a smoke. A smoke, and offered Dennis the opportunity to go up front with the pilot. Dennis didn't think lighting up a cigar in the presence of a cargo of gasoline drums was a good idea, but said nothing and went up to join the pilot. "The weather is too bad. We're going to have to go back to Panama." The pilot seemed to think nothing was unusual about Dennis going to Panama. I don't have my passport," Dennis said. "I have to go back to Villa Vicencio. I was just kidding. We have to go pick up the rest of the crew anyway. We might as well give you a look at the Llanos. I'll drop us down under the cloud cover." And with that, he took the plane into a screaming nosedive, emerging below the clouds about 300 feet above the ground. "Take a look. Flat grassland. It's like this for thousands of miles, and the only thing you see besides grass is an occasional river. Well, hey, look at that. A herd of cows." So the next 10 minutes made indelible impression on the young man from North Dakota. The pilot put the plane in a dive right at those cows, sending them splay-legged running in abject terror. The terror was shared by the newly installed co-pilot. After 6 passes with the genuine U.S. Air Force government-issue aircraft at a height of maybe, 8 to 10 feet off the ground, the pilot grew bored with the exercise and pulled up to 150 feet. Taking hands off the wheel, he asks, "Ever fly one of these before?" Without hesitation, Dennis replied, "Nope, I don't want to either." "Well, at this rate, we are going to hit the ground soon, so maybe you should learn how to fly." The pilot was really enjoying his passenger's distress. "To go up, you pull it back, just like this." The plane climbed into a near stall. "To go down, just push it forward like this." The plane plummeted toward the ground. With no choice, the frightened passenger came up with the perfect solution. "I think I'm going to be sick." Not wanting his passenger to get sick in his plane, the pilot pulled the airplane up above the clouds and headed the craft back toward Villa Vicencio. The remainder of the flight was uneventful until evening, arriving back at the city. To give notice to the rest of the crew to get to the air base, the crusty old veteran pilot just buzzed the hotel twice and headed to the airfield, landed, and parked the airplane at the far end of the runway, on the grass this time. 10 minutes later, the truant crew members walked out and rejoined the crew who had busied themselves with the task of rolling the barrels of gasoline out the door of the airplane and letting them bump onto the ground. The bewildered volunteer asked what they were going to do with the gasoline and was told that the crew would be back in a couple of weeks to try it again. "Well, what about me? What should I do?" Dennis asked. "Well, I guess if I were you, I'd jump that cyclone fence and hike back to town before the soldiers show up. We're heading for Panama." With that, they started up the aircraft and took off without bothering to get clearance. With no alternative, Dennis climbed over the fence, aware of the drone of the departing aircraft, and it was a long walk back to town. But in Guacavia, the days had become routine for the volunteer. Long, dark, boring nights, all alone, separated from any close neighbors. Reminders of the violencia were everywhere, but Dennis did not share the fears of the villagers who refused to walk alone at night, nor did he join in the custom of walking with other men while holding hands as a source of security. One day, without warning, the Peace Corps sent out an official to Guacavia who told Dennis to pack up his belongings and accompany him back to Bogota, where he would be given a new assignment. The official said that the Peace Corps had been contacted by someone from Guacavia who told them that it would be a good idea for Don Daniel to leave. It had something to do with stories of a man, Jaime somebody or other, who had been heard making threats against the American's life. So the town bully, who wouldn't challenge Dennis openly again, had been making threats behind his back. Did the menacing promises really represent truly dangerous intentions, or were they merely the meaningless utterances of a slightly deranged and humiliated individual? Dennis wasn't particularly worried, but the Peace Corps was not about to take any chances. So Dennis was hustled back to Bogota. The Llanos was left devoid of Colombia 64 volunteers except for occasional visitors. The great grassland of Colombia was left to the llaneros, the cattle, the Indians, and the mosquitoes. Only occasionally would a Pina ETV volunteer pass this way, usually making just a short stop on his or her way to somewhere else. The Llanos would remain an enigmatic frontier to the volunteers, not unlike the perception most Colombians had of their eastern domain. One more story. They got to get out of Colombia. At some point, the experience in the Peace Corps comes to an end. And so after being having been assigned to a small, actually gold mining town, was for the remaining 6 months of his time, or however long it was, he, like everybody else, termination time came for the group of Peace Corps volunteers associated with 1964. And they would all end up back in, I think Bogota is where they ended up, in Bogota. Does that sound right? Yeah. So this is a fun story, what had occurred there. For all of the volunteers of Columbia 64, they showed up in the nation's capital for termination, and they were the final closing accounts, turning in of the last-minute reports that they had to do, and of course, that last physical. And there was that last party. The last party. I seriously doubt that any Peace Corps group ever hosted a more spectacular going-away party than our event. Our group was not about to leave Colombia with a whimper. No, we would go out with a resounding cannon-like boom. The party was planned by the volunteers in Bogota, led by Ken Weissman and Eugene Roberts. Louis Jerussi talked the owners of the how do you say this? Balalaika? There you go. Balalaika into using the restaurant for the party. Arrangements were in the final stages, and it looked to be a fine party, but Ken Weissman and Eugene Roberts decided it needed an added touch, something special, something out of the ordinary. And there, on the Tequendama Hotel marquee, was the answer. Jane Mansfield, the blonde sex symbol. She was the headliner at the hotel's nightclub. Ken and Eugene decided that the Broadway and Hollywood star was just what the party needed. First, Ken had the ETV art department make an honorary Peace Corps plaque for the star. The plaque would be presented to Miss Mansfield at the party, but how to get an invitation to the performer was the question. Jerry Schaffer relates the story told to him by Eugene Roberts as to how he and Ken went about inviting this very special guest to the party. Eugene and Ken were in the U.S. Embassy. Ken saw some embassy stationery that was unattended and stuffed a couple of sheets into his coat pocket. They returned to the hotel and typed a letter to Jane Mansfield, encouraging her to attend the Peace Corps party, and signed it using the U.S. ambassador's name. They tried to deliver the letter to her at her hotel, but the clerk would not give out the room number. So they went from floor to floor. They found a room with a Colombian soldier standing guard. They pushed him aside and gained access to the room. They delivered the letter to Miss Mansfield's manager. The pair waited for a reply, but heard nothing. Time was running out. Well, Eugene and Ken decided what desperate situations call for desperate measures. Weissman and Roberts crashed a rehearsal for Jane's act that was about to be opened at the Tequendama Hotel. As the rehearsal breaks, Weissman and Roberts approach Miss Mansfield, show her the plaque, and invite her personally to the Balalaika party where they plan to make her an honorary Peace Corps volunteer. Receiving a tacit acceptance, the two volunteers leave not fully satisfied, but with hope their special guest would make it to the party. So, with preparations made, the final party for Columbia 64 began. The band was the number one band in Columbia, according to my father-in-law, Los Fliperes. We were all assessed a sum of money for the party and the meal, but those who had more gave more. Etched in my memory was throwing in 1.5 months' pay because I never could spend all my pay in my sight and surely have no use for it since we were leaving. Something like 2,300 pesos, I think. I remember the 1.5 months' pay thing as I never again in my lifetime spent that much on one night's party. It was truly a great party, and the group enjoyed their last hurrah with the gusto typical of Columbia 64. Then, just as the party is beginning to wind down, Jane Mansfield showed up with her entourage. I'd pretty much made up my mind that I didn't like her because she had indicated earlier that she wasn't coming, but she danced and talked to anyone who wanted to meet her, was intelligent, fun, and witty. Jane drank imported American whiskey to the tune of about 800 pesos. She wore a white vinyl jacket with huge black polka dots on the front and small ones on the back, black and white vinyl skirt, and high boots. A member of another ETV group wearing a 40s zoot suit, who was Ken Weissman, he had bought that especially for the party, ended up in the men's room with Jane Mansfield, switching clothing. She emerges wearing his zoot suit, and he makes an entrance wearing her vinyl jacket and miniskirt. The crowd roared their approval. By now, Miss Mansfield and her entourage had run quite a food bill up, and beverages as well. Also, the contracted time for the band and use of the balalaika were just about up. If there's one thing in the group learned while they were in Colombia, it was that you don't shut down a party before the participants are ready. Weissman extended the party until dawn. In the finest Colombian tradition, he and Roberts decide they would figure out how to pay for it mañana. Miss Mansfield danced with all the guys who wanted to dance with her and talked to everyone. Jane Mansfield may have had a very successful nightclub tour in South America, I don't know, but I suspect she received more applause and collected more goodwill that night than she ever did at her nightclub acts. During all this revelry, there just had to be one more than one sideshow. My father-in-law remembers some drunk Colombian tough guy who was annoying as hell, and eventually someone from the group called his bluff and offered to step outside and settle it. The Colombian kicked off his shoes, claiming he was a black belt. And then one of the volunteers, Rodney Spokley, the littlest guy in the group, picked up his shoes and threw them over one of those high fences with broken bottles stuck into the cement on the top to keep out intruders. The tough guy slunk off like a beaten dog with his tail between his legs. Finally, there was the ride back to the hotel. Some dozen of the most hardy who had toughed it out until dawn hailed a cab. I remember the ride in on the cab. It was already daylight, and I think it was Schaefer and a few others, probably. Freddie, because he was always part of their craziness. Anyway, the last party in Columbia ended for this group of volunteers who had first assembled in Lincoln and the University of Nebraska 2 years before. It had been an interesting and eventful 24 months, but now each one of them was looking forward to moving on with their lives. There would be those staying behind and putting in a few more months, even another year in Columbia. That Brian McMahon we talked about planned to stay in country and go into business with a couple of Colombians in an artificial insemination breeding company. Others would be returning to the U.S. to help train replacements. And then there were those planning on a tour of South America or maybe motorcycling all the way home. Little did any of them realize or even give a thought to where they would be 40, 50 years later. They were young and restless, and the Peace Corps experience just seemed to confirm their conviction that all things were possible. For Denny, in the back of the book, they'll kind of give you the rundown of what they did. He did return to the U.S., of course, eventually ending up back in North Dakota. He graduated from Minot State, married Beverly, and they had 2 children, my wife Heidi and my brother-in-law Reed. Beverly and I, according to Denny, they taught for many years in school in North Dakota. At one juncture, they did travel to Columbia and spent several months just touring the country with the intent of finding work there, but eventually they decided against that, and they returned to the United States. They moved to Iowa about 20 years or so after that, where he was employed, as I mentioned, with the Winnebago Industries as the general manager of the Winnebago Itasca Travelers Club, and that gave him the opportunity to travel extensively throughout America for about 8 years. Then he said, "There's no question I received more than I was able to give back during my Peace Corps experience. The training, the 2 years living in Columbia, and the profound influence of my Peace Corps friends had a tremendous impact on me. My eyes were opened wide, my horizons were expanded, and my life was changed forever." That's just one part of a long life, 81 years, almost 82 would have been in December. Many adventures, many stories, many, many people that he affected on the way. And we miss him. We miss him tremendously. But it was a good life. It was a great life. And we look forward. Now that he has gone on to his final tea time, we look to playing and seeing each other once again. Rest in peace, Denny Burkholder.
I think my students are going to have good memories of me. I'm not so sure my superintendents shared that. But I never got fired, so that's a good benchmark. And I had kids that said, "Hey, we miss you." So that was nice. It was easy. I wasn't out to flunk anybody. I was out to make them succeed. So why would you break their hearts? It just didn't go that way. And we had fun in our classes. And we read fun stuff. And I can't say that for sure, but I would guess 90% of my students thought well of me, because I told jokes and they did dumb stuff. And a lot of those teachers are really boring. Or in case you slept through that class, you wouldn't notice. Yeah, But I've thought of doing it again. But I got told having kids give good feedback. I mean, that was how they paid, was say, going to miss you next year. Nice. And the next year they found out they were right. I don't know. My mistake in the whole thing is I went into administration. Sucks. That was a bad move. Paid better, and that's about all. All we had to sell was ads, period. There were no verbal conversations. It was just blah. And we were trying to sell ads because we made money doing that. And we didn't make any money off of the articles at all. But I think we had readers. I mean, we got good response from people and whatever. I don't think their idea of a good time is go look at ads. And so it worked out. I had a few neighboring newspapers that picked it up, and I got a little money out of that, but not much either. But I had to kind of regear those, not talk like we're in Forest City if this is somebody from 40 miles down the road. But it was an interesting time. It wasn't of really any value monetarily to me. I didn't make anything out of it. I think it embarrassed Beverly. But I got good feedback. Well, she loves part of her life in shame. Isn't that? I think that goes with being women. Many years ago in late January, my bride-to-be met me at a college party and immediately fell victim to my barley-fortified charm and charisma. Well, maybe she wasn't totally infatuated with me at first sight, but she did retract her first statement about me being a big egotistical jerk. Later, she settled on calling me an obnoxious, immature toad. After arguing for 4 hours about the American flag, we parted company on reasonably civil terms. We had no contact again for several weeks until she broke down and sent me a Valentine's card, which included her telephone number. How obvious is that? I telephoned her and we had a real date on or about the middle of February. We were married March 22nd. Incidentally, daughter number 1 was born 5 years later, and number 1 son was born 8 years after that. You can feel free to make up your own punchline. We were to be married at 5 p.m. in a campus church located right across the street from the fraternity house where I lived. My best friend at the time could not be my best man because his religious leader would not allow him to participate in a wedding that was taking place outside his own faith. It aggravated me that I had to tell someone else about our clandestine wedding, but I had to have a best man I could trust. I asked Freddie Omar, a foreign exchange student from some long-forgotten country, if he would do it. Freddie said, "Yeah, I do it." At 4:30 that afternoon, I hung up my cue stick at the corner pool hall and told my roommate that I had to get back to the fraternity house, so he gave me a ride. I took a shower and put on my high school graduation suit, walked across the street where Freddie and the bride and her bridesmaid awaited beautifully. Well, Freddie wasn't beautiful by any stretch, but the bride wearing her $7.50 corsage certainly was. At 5:05 p.m., I promised to love, honor, and cherish my bride, and she in turn promised to love, honor, and obey her husband. And just like that, we were man and wife, or woman and husband, if that suits you better. We paid the college pastor $10, returned to the fraternity house to get my luggage, and left on a honeymoon to Minneapolis. En route, we stopped for supper, whereupon I inexplicably ordered liver and onions. Make up your own punchline. We were married, hitched, till death do us have a funeral. Marriage license, $3. Corsage, $7.50. Preacher, $10. Liver and onions, $3.50. Martini, Rossi, Asti, Spumante, Champagne, $4.95. Try that today. Total cost, $28.95. We've been married for 56 years. Less than $1 per year. It just goes to prove that good glue ain't expensive.
When the shadows fall and doubts begin to creep, remember together we're strong, never weak. Lift your neighbor up with kindness every day. Let your actions speak the words you want to say.
The Sunny Side of Life is a weekly production about our life on the family farmstead here in Iowa, the liberties we prize, and the pursuits which make us happy. None of this is possible, of course, without Christ in our lives. For the Lord God is our sun and our shield. He gives us grace and glory.
Be the sunny side of someone else's life. Share your light and joy through struggle and strife. Keep your heart open and your soul always bright. Together we will share this sunny side life. Be the sunny side of someone else's life. Share your light and joy through struggle and strife. Keep your heart open and your soul always bright. Together we will share this sunny side life.
May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may the sunny side of your life in Christ be made evident unto you each and every day, and give you peace.